Welcome back to the shed. We've got a big issue to talk through today, but first a couple of thoughts. I am by nature a very optimistic person, and even more a grateful member of this generation. Everywhere I look, I'm thankful for the wonderful things and opportunities our Creator has given us. But the way we've decided to live our lives and the choices we have made over generations means it hasn't always been good. It's against that context that in this episode I will tell you about the world's next great challenge. And no, it is not global warming. I grew up in Australia in the 60s and early 70s, a time of great uncertainty, rather like today, actually. The world was deep in Vietnam. The threat of nuclear war was intense, and everyone was gripped by the fear of a population explosion that threatened the entire planet, allegedly. In 1968, Paul Ehrlich, a professor of population studies at Stanford University, published a book called The Population Bomb, predicting worldwide famine and advocating radical measures to reduce population. In the opening lines of that book, Ehrlich said, "The battle to feed humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. We are today involved in the events leading to famine and eco-catastrophe. Tomorrow, we may be destroyed by them." Ehrlich and his followers explored all kinds of measures for population control, even mass sterilization through the water supply. I have read the book, and it was uncomfortable reading, I can tell you. In fairness to Ehrlich, he never actually believed mass sterilization was a realistic option. Not because he didn't like the idea, only because it was just too hard. He did, however, actively lobby for incentives he called responsibility prizes to couples for each 5 years of childless marriage, or bonuses for vasectomies, or lotteries with tickets only for the childless. Ehrlich's book kicked off a movement for ZPG, zero population growth. In fact, Ehrlich ran a non-profit called Zero Population Growth, Inc., with local chapters all over the United States. The most disturbing feature of all this for me was a feeling that this was probably the beginning of a horrible trend towards hate for humanity, a trend that has infected many institutions, including some sections of the environmental movement. In Ehrlich's own words, we can no longer afford merely to treat the symptoms of the cancer of population growth. The cancer itself must be cut out. Of course, not only was Ehrlich deranged, he was also wrong, miscalculating the actual population trends and ignoring important improvements in global food production. Strangely, though, that reality never took away that fear of overpopulation. It is still there today. You can still hear people complaining there are just too many of us. Well, I have good news for all those with a distaste for humanity. There's evidence that global population growth will stop in about 50 years and then steeply decline. The world currently supports 8.2 billion people. That's double the number in the mid-1970s. But with fertility rates declining everywhere except sub-Saharan Africa, it's now believed the global population will peak at 9 to 10 billion people by 2075. That's 50 years from now. And then begins the big decline. Populations have already peaked, i.e. ZPG, in countries and regions covering almost 1/3 of the world, and that includes Europe. And then, according to demographers, if current fertility rates persist, the population will decline dramatically, possibly down to half current levels, or as one forecast predicts, even to just 2 billion people within 200 years. That's down to 1/4 of today's population. Here are some of the most recent fertility rates by country, and as you can see, only Indonesia and sub-Saharan African countries are at or above the replacement level of 2.1 babies per woman. Just to make the point, India, once considered the world's best at big families, fell below the replacement rate 2 years ago. No one seems to be sure how this has become a global phenomenon, and even more, no one seems to know how to reverse it. The United Nations has published new data which clearly illustrates what's been happening worldwide over the past 50 years. As you can see, the world's fertility rate back in the 70s was well over 5 children in the lifetime of the average woman. And now it's just above replacement rate. And for the future, all the UN's projections suggest continuing decline through the end of this century. Now, the most shocking case in all this is that of South Korea, where the birth rate is less than 1. This is clearly a crisis, with predictions that the population of Korea will halve in the coming decades, and roughly half that population will be elderly. It's worth spending a moment thinking about why this has happened. Here are some of the explanations in the case of Korea: high costs of living, particularly housing and education, long working hours, and societal pressures on women to prioritise careers over families. Now, that last point could be a factor across many Western countries too, where the woke agenda has had some success in making motherhood a dirty word and raising a family no longer a virtue. Here in Italy, this problem definitely represents a crisis. With a fertility rate of just 1.2, the population is already in decline. Last year, the number of people dying was almost double the number of babies born. And to make it worse, around 30% of young people expect to leave the country to find work. Another fascinating feature of the United Nations report is the ageing of the world's population. This will be the biggest story in global economics in the years ahead. For example, the UN report shows the number of people under the age of 25 has already peaked at 3.2 billion and already in decline. No more young people. And remember, we know that as prosperity grows, people tend to have fewer children. Think about that. The world will be a more prosperous place in the decades ahead, resulting in very low fertility rates and year-on-year ZPG. So with economic growth, the population decline will compound, and compound quickly. It's kind of hard to imagine this world with a population 1/2 or even 1/4 of what it is now, but that will happen if current trends continue. The approaching impact of all this is quite profound. And to try to understand that, I was able recently to speak with a real expert on this subject, demographer Dr. Morland, the author of 4 important books on the subject of global demographics, the most recent with the title of No One Left: Why the World Needs More Children. Dr. Paul Morland, thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for asking me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Paul, I've been following your work and doing a lot of reading, and I think I understand the scale of this problem. But from your point of view, just how big an issue is this?
Well, perhaps if you'll allow me, I'll go back a little bit historically. So you go from low population with a high fertility and a high death rate to a large population with a low fertility and a low death rate and long life expectancy. And that is basically where we thought we were in the 70s. Britain was the first country to go through that process. It then spread throughout Europe. And back in the 70s, the least developed countries in the world were just starting to enter that process. So then we thought it kind of settled at about 2. Now, 2 things are really upending that. I mean, first of all, there's a general progress through that of more and more countries. So that today, it was once the case in most countries that perhaps a quarter of children would die before they reached the age of 1. And now I think the worst performer, something like Sierra Leone, it might be 70 per thousand. So pretty horrendous, but a fraction of what it would have been back. So lots of countries have now moved through that. That would imply that we're living longer and we're having fewer children just because the world's making material progress. And that would all have been predictable in the 70s. But 2 things have really sort of shaken that. The first is that the rising life expectancy and the falling fertility have happened much more quickly to countries that are still poor, because you tend to put your focus on giving people the basics, and because the basics get you a very long way. We now have countries like, if you looked at the gap in life expectancy, say, between India and America, 20, 30, 40 years ago, it might have been 20 years, and now it's perhaps 5 years. So right. the catching up of still quite poor countries in terms of their life expectancy has been phenomenal, largely to do with their getting their infant mortality rates down. But then the other thing, which has been a great surprise, is that as countries get more educated and wealthy and urban, their fertility rate falls. But that's happened much quicker and earlier than people would have expected. So again, somewhere like India is now coming below 2 children per woman, although it's still quite a poor country. If you were to take all the states of the United States and include Puerto Rico as one of them, Puerto Rico would have the lowest fertility rate of any state in the US. But what's shocking is how low it's gone, not only in countries like Britain, America, continental Europe, where it's sort of knocked around a bit below 2 for a long time, but now it's really going down to like 1.5 and below. Central and Eastern Europe is lower still. China, Russia, Germany is very low, but Eastern Europe, it's gone sort of super low, below 1. So nobody exactly knows where it is in China today, but it's probably about 1 child per woman. And South Korea, it went down to about 0.7. So you get 2 people creating 0.7 of a person, if you like. And that really is the shocker.
Allow me to pause there for just a moment. Obviously, what we have here is 2 older men opining on the difficult conflict that women face in choosing between family and career or managing both. Now, I would never want to sit in judgment of any woman's choice in this. What we're dealing with here is a discussion about the implications of what's happening, not the rights or wrongs of it. Let's get back to Paul Morland.
The process is happening quicker. It's happening more rapidly to poor countries or developing countries than you'd expect. And the fertility rate is going lower in the developed world and even in the less developed world. So that, for example, Jamaica and Thailand have got lower fertility rates than Britain. And a former prime minister of Japan did speak about societal collapse. So the Japanese understand this. So the other example I would give you is that of Korea, where the replacement level was reached only in the 80s, so they've got a bit more fuel in the tank, if you like. The problem's not been quite so long-standing, but it's been severer. And if you get down to about 2/3 of a child per couple, that's slightly above that, but let's say 2/3 of a child per couple, you then have 100 grandparents making 33 of the next generation, call them parents, 11 children. So you kind of lose 85 to 90% of your cohort from generation from the parent from the generation the cohort of the grandparents, the cohort of the grandchildren.
If you look at that number in Korea being well under 1, how likely is it that the Western countries will be reporting similar kind of numbers in the future?
I think it's fairly likely if you look at the current drop. So, places like the UK are falling fairly fast. Scandinavia is falling fairly fast. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe have been low for a long time, but seem to be knocking around perhaps more reliably at 1.3, 1.4. When it starts falling as fast as it has done recently in the States, in the UK and Scandinavia, parts of the developed world which have traditionally been better, it's very hard to know where the next floor is going to be. The question really is what's going on. And I think ultimately it's cultural. So I think we maybe can come on to this. There are a whole bunch of economic things we can do to help young people have children. But if you survey the 20-somethings, the 25-year-olds today who might be just starting to have children, and you ask them about their attitudes to relationships, or you look at actually empirically at their relationships, their likelihood of getting married or seriously partnering up, their desire for children probably appears to be holding up perhaps a bit better, but their lifestyles and aspirations are not really congruent with having families anytime soon. So I think as Generation Z becomes a larger and larger share of the cohort who would be having children, you will see the fertility rate in the West continue to go down. And it's very hard to say how low.
So let's talk about some of the possible solutions. And I've seen you talk about possible solutions under mainly 3 big headings, being government, there are limitations to what they can do. Immigration is not a sensible solution, it's too risky. And technology. Look, I agree with your position on that. I don't think robots are actually going to be terribly helpful for what we're going to need taking care of all of these older people in the future. And then you go on to say that it's really about a big cultural and educational task. But it struck me that you'd almost have to get to coercion, wouldn't you? Telling everybody, hey, get out there and make some babies.
Well, first of all, I want to come back on all of that, but let me say I don't believe in coercion. And I have said before, and I'll say it again, that I would rather the human race died out than it only survived by means of coercion. Of course, there's coercion and persuasion. I'm not ruling out persuasion, far from it. But when it gets to the point you actually force people to have children, or you ban contraception, as for example, the communists did in Romania. Communists tend to say, right, we want more kids, no contraception. No, we want fewer kids, one-child policy. And, this very brutalist, directional, anti-libertarian attitude of communism, probably on the right in places as well, I would never approve of. So if we then move on to what government and society can do, I kind of think of it now in terms of material and cultural. I think there are things the government can do on the material side, reorganizing the welfare state to help young families get started, to make sure there's the housing, the childcare. Certainly we need the childcare because we don't want women out of the workforce. Women should be able to freely choose whether they want to participate in the workforce, and we won't solve our lack of workers by saying goodbye to women. And I'm very pleased that my wife had a great career, my daughters are having great careers. I'm not someone who wants to reverse that in the slightest. I always say we need to reinvent feminism for the 2030s, not go back to some kind of 1950s existence. So there are material incentives that can be put in place to encourage people to have children. Tax breaks, housing, etc., etc. The list is long. None of them is going to transform this. It might increase the fertility rate, if you're lucky, from 1.3 to 1.5, as in Hungary, but it's not going to transform it. Transformation is going to require a cultural shift. Now, I just don't think government has no role to play in that. I think government can affect culture, and I think we as a society need to rethink the welfare state, and we need to rethink our culture if we take this as seriously as I do. And I don't think it will get fixed simply by politicians getting it. But I don't think it will get fixed without politicians getting it. Yes. I think that's a necessary but not sufficient condition. The question is then what they do. but they're not going to do anything if they don't get it. So I think
Yes.
more and more of them are getting it. I'd love to know whether Rachel Reeves, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, has any idea that the fundamental problem she is facing is this aging sclerotic. As societies age, fewer and fewer entrepreneurs, fewer and fewer inventors, more and more people who need looking after. An 85-year-old needs perhaps 7 or 8 times the spend on healthcare that a 25-year-old. So there's pensions, there's social care, there's healthcare. All the things we talked about are year by year acting sclerotically on the economy.
It would be just awful if we found ourselves sleepwalking into a disaster with this thing.
Which I think is what we are doing at the moment. And we're still, I suppose the only thing I can say is we're gradually waking up, but we're still walking in the same direction.
Still walking. Paul, you've been so helpful. There are many, many other issues we could have covered today, but we've just run out of time. Maybe we'll do that another time.
It would be a pleasure.
I appreciate it. Thank you. So this is a very big deal. And as Paul Morland explained, there are no obvious, simple solutions. Now, this, of course, has an interesting effect on the way we ought to be thinking about the other problem, climate change. What you are about to hear is not widely reported because people are afraid of the population becoming disheartened and giving up on climate. Based on the current models, the first time the world will enjoy the full benefits of net zero carbon effort will be 2080, more or less in line with the steep decline in the world's population. It's 55 years from now. I will be gone, my children will be in their 90s, and my grandchildren will be middle-aged. Now, I'm not suggesting that I should ignore it through that self-centered view as a good reason to do nothing about climate. That argument about doing nothing is coming up in just a moment. That year of 2080 is the first time the economic and climate benefits of all the net zero carbon work will overtake the staggering costs involved. More importantly, at that time, the world population will already be in decline. As I explained earlier, with the obvious downward pressure on the carbon emissions of humans. Fewer people, fewer human-generated carbon emissions. I sure hope somebody's running the numbers on this. Is it possible that the whole anti-carbon effort was never necessary? Maybe, with a smaller population, CO2 would decline naturally at no cost, unlike the current plan with trillions of dollars spent in trying to force that change. Maybe. In the episodes coming up, I will share with you my 12 reasons why I believe climate change is not as bad as you have been told. And I will outline some of the implications of the catastrophic decline in population that is inevitably heading our way. This will be the big story of our generation, and much more important than climate, bringing profound changes to our way of life. Stay tuned.